Hi, this is Sheb. Welcome to the Faith Colloquium podcast. Today, my guest is Kjerstin Kauffman. Kjerstin did her master's degree at Johns Hopkins University, and today we're talking about poetry. Thanks for talking with me, Kjerstin.
Sure.
So, you've studied poetry for some time, and you're a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm wondering what you think the value is of poetry for Christians. Why is it something that Christians should invest time in reading or studying or anything like that?
Yeah. Well, the first answer that comes to mind for that is that like portions of the Bible are poetry. So, I mean, specifically in the genre, like poetry genre, like the Psalms or portions of Revelation, you know, some say the creation story and so on. So
yeah,
it makes sense from that point of view. I guess when I'm thinking about questions of the value of anything or studying anything, like one thing that would come to mind is like what, like how do you think of knowledge generally? Or like, how do you think of, like, what do you think of the purpose of study or education or learning, like a particular thing in general? Because culturally we can have this sense that knowledge is like a thing that you use, like to get like a means to an end,
right?
Kind of perspective.
Right.
So yeah, like sometimes when people ask what the value is of something, it can betray that you have maybe a presupposition that you're like, you know, like that the thing itself is like to get you somewhere.
Sure.
Like you're using it to like overcome all these obstacles to be like, you know, the best version of yourself or achieve certain goals. Where some things might, you know, it might be possible for them to be valuable in and of themselves or just because they're part of the created order, part of the human experience.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for me, poetry or any art form it's just like delightful in and of itself.
Yeah. So like, what would be the point of it? That question in itself, you might be like, well, it's not for like, you do this so you can get some other thing, right? That would be maybe a not helpful way of thinking about it. So you mentioned the Psalms a second ago. In what ways are the Psalms poetry? I feel like a lot of Christians read the Psalms and they're just this section in the Bible. They don't think of like, when they think like poetry, they might have like different things that come to mind other than the Psalms. Okay. Like in what ways are the Psalms poetry?
I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I can't speak to exactly what's going on in the language. Sure. But but I can say that they follow certain formal patterns, and that when we think about what a poem is, it almost always is paying attention to pattern in some way, whether it's the pattern of, you know, in English, we obviously think of like rhyme or meter as kind of the backbone of what we consider to be received form. The form's different for Hebrew poetry. I know that much. I know it has a lot to do with parallelism, like one half of the line mirroring the other. So we've been memorizing a psalm in our family, Psalm 90 in the KJV. So it says things like, who knoweth the power of thine anger, even according to thy fear, so is thy wrath, or even according to our fear, so is thy wrath. So you can hear words like fear and wrath being paired, you know, with the first half. So I know that it's worth thinking about how the different halves of the Psalms are corresponding. Like, are they in conflict with each other? Are they showing a similarity? Are they making some kind of extension? Like, so teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Like that would be more of an extension. And those three basic like modes of revealing something that's the same or revealing something that's different or making some kind of extension are really the basis of all poems in all languages. I think you could say is like one of the very root kind of pattern of what a poem is. And even rhyme is showing a similarity between words. And if a poet's really good, they'll try to do something additional, you know, like the rhyme the sound is the same, but what about the word itself? Like, what comparison is happening between the two words that are the same?
Yeah.
So, you can think about, just like even as a reader who knows nothing about Hebrew, you can read a translation and look for structural patterns.
Right.
I mean, sometimes people just mean if it's something's poetic or poetry, they just mean it sounds like more important, like it sounds like stately or ornate, or it's more laden with metaphor. You can find, figurative language, like you can find all those qualities in the Psalms in ways that are more intense than other forms of poetry. But there's a lot more going on there that I just don't have access to, not being a scholar.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
So how can we be open or malleable to letting scripture change us by reading the Psalms as poetry?
I think you're right about the fact that it often seems like reading someone's private journal. And in that way, they're doing what all poems do, which is be both introspective and communal. So they have like an inward move and an outward move. And if poems fail, they tend to fail in one of those two ways. Like they're not introspective enough, or they're too introspective, they don't make that move outward toward the community. And in the case of the Psalms, like the divine presence or God is like is a part of it too. I don't know if you would say that's like a third piece, or some might just see it as a part of the poet's introspection, depending on, where you come from. But so, I mean, it's really a chance for us to be with the poet in a very intimate place. Like poets also like to talk about poems as rooms. The word stanza comes from the Italian word that means room. So poets are also aware of the poem itself as a room or a place where the poet is inviting you in or meeting with someone. In this case, the poet's meeting with God in this very intimate place, and you're invited into that. And it's an opportunity for you to get outside of yourself and into someone else's encounter with God. Yeah. Someone else's, the place where they're meeting with God in a very intimate way. Yeah. A more practical answer might be that they just give us patterns and framework by which we might communicate with God.
Sure.
And the patterns and the elevation of the language, they just help us to pay attention, listen up. They just say hey, this is important because we're getting all of these signals. We hear things, and we have certain physical responses to poetic techniques. I mean, I'm going to use rhyme because I'm I write poetry in English, but when we hear a rhyme, we have a physical response to that. We actually feel a kind of consolation when language is just resolved into rhyme. And it's mysterious, but I just read an essay by the poet A. Stallings, who talks about, when critics listen to poems, when critics listen to rhyme, when anyone listens to rhyme, including critics, she doesn't know what goes on, but the response to the rhyme is emotional. So when we read the Psalms as poems, or we're aware of them as poems, I mean, I just think it helps us to cultivate attentiveness, to cultivate listening, and to experience a form of prayer that is more like getting outside yourself than the spontaneous prayer might be, which is important too. But
yeah. So these are encounters that this poet has had with God.
Yeah.
And
with reality, with the world,
with the creation and everything. Yeah. And it's our kind of way into that, and maybe sharing in that a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. So you talked about this feature of poetry as being introspective and also communal, and that if a poem fails, it's because it fails at one of those things or something like that. But isn't it the case that poetry, it's super personal, right? So again, when I think about, the experiences I had, you kind of try writing poetry, and it's this kind of personal, subjective. Yeah, like kind of write whatever you want, write whatever you feel. And it's kind of like, yeah, that poem is your poem and it's like good for you. And that's all that matters.
Well, I don't think of it that way, but yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I'm curious to hear like why
I think
not?
People have had experiences of poetry like that. I don't know. I really haven't, but
okay.
I would say poetry is subjective in as much as like there is a person writing the poem and it comes from a singular individual's encounter with like I said, the world, reality.
Right.
But I think of like John Henry Newman, who writes that, you know, you are an I, like you're a person. So, and he says egotism is true modesty because you're not forgetful of the fact that you actually, you know, are a person. You're like a limited person. You're not like a universal, like I or like brain or something like overlooking all reality. You're like a person with like, you know,
you're a subject.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's subjective in that sense.
Yeah, it's subjective in that sense, but that, I mean, of course, there's technique involved, as there is with any art.
Does that mean that poetry is like a subcategory of art then, or? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then that would, I guess, be a broader conversation about whether like art is subjective or objective.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
But it sounds like you're saying there are still features of it that make it better or not.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when we have certain responses to a poem, it's because on some level the writer knows what they're doing. I mean, it happens that a writer might be, you know, especially gifted or, you know, not be conscious of the techniques that they're in play. But I think that only happens after a good deal of practice with the techniques, the pieces that go into making a poem. So like W.H. Auden uses an analogy to like a table or a motorcycle. Like those are the two different things that a poem is like constructed like a table, constructed like a machine. I mean, the machine analogy causes people all kinds of discomfort because when we experience a poem, we experience mystery. And even the poet, him or herself, is often having the experience of speaking about something which is mysterious to them.
Right.
But through specific techniques.
Yeah. And so it sounds like you're saying there's better and worse ways to describe the mystery.
I think so.
The mystery.
Okay. I think so. Yeah. I mean, poems operate according to certain laws. I mean, it's language that's operating according to certain laws. So if I were writing a piece of criticism about like a collection of poems, for example, like the first thing I would do is try to figure out what laws are the poems operating according to, like what are they setting out for themselves to do, and then how well are they executing that. And that might be anything from, you know, are they using very strict received form, like are they using a particular meter, particular rhyme scheme, you know, or are they operating, how do they like break the line? Who's the speaker in the poem? What's the narrative process of the poem? What's happening? Like all those individual decisions. Is the poem itself a metaphor? Is it a riddle? Like what genre of poetry is it? And how well is it executing that genre? So there are any, myriad of laws that a poem could operate according to, but those are things that you can learn, you know?
Okay, yeah.
But I think also I would evaluate a poem just based on whether it offers pleasure. That's a huge part of what a poem is, and what I most seek from poetry is just the experience of it being delightful and pleasurable to listen to. And we don't always know what that comes from. So sometimes we can pinpoint specifically to, you know, the interplay of sounds or a turn in a strategic place or, you know, something like that. But sometimes it just comes together and is just like mysterious and beautiful. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I've got like 2 questions.
Yeah.
So like the one question is, does that mean like someone who, let's say, reads a poem, and you think it's like a really bad poem, but someone else reads it and is like, oh, I was so moved by that. Like, would you think, oh, like you actually shouldn't like feel this way, or like this poem isn't actually all that impressive or something like that? Yeah, I guess that would be one question.
Oh, okay. That's hard. If someone, and a poem, I mean, when someone's moved by a poem, they are having like an experience of reverence, I would say. Much like, if you walked into a sacred space or heard a very beautiful piece of music, I would say that you can be more or less attuned to beauty, like the thing that causes that reverence in you.
Mm-hmm. So why is it, do you think, because when I first kind of told you my experience, you said it seems like a lot of people say that, right, about poetry being this like, oh, just like write whatever you want,
spew your feelings on the page or whatever.
Right, yeah. And subjective in the sense of like there's no kind of laws that govern it, right?
Yeah.
Why do you think that is the case for a lot of people, that's been their experience?
Well, people long to be expressive. I mean, it's part of who we are as humans.
Sure.
I have to think about that.
I guess I'm wondering more about like, is that something to do with like the way that poetry's taught?
I'm sure it is. Yeah. If someone said that to me though, like I would, if someone brought me a poem that they had written in which they were just totally expressive, I guess I might like try to say like, like you have so many tools at your disposal to communicate this between you and another person. Maybe that's part of it, is that we're not, I mean, that would be like the introspective community piece.
Right.
Like you might lose the opportunity to communicate your experience to someone else. And there are so many means at your disposal to do that well, and to do that with nuance.
But I feel like the response, like the kind of attitude, again, from my experience, is kind of like, I don't really care about making sure other people understand this. It's more of just like, this is what I feel, right? And like, you're welcome to understand me or not, right? And I feel like there's kind of,
that's sad.
Okay, well, I was gonna say like, I feel like there's a lot of like applause given just for the fact of like of self-expression, right? Of like, oh, the mere fact of expressing yourself is valuable or something like that.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you have concerns with that.
I mean, I would just say that you just isolate yourself by doing that. I guess if you're not inviting someone else into your experience.
Sure.
It would seem unfortunate.
Sure.
Like a lost opportunity. But yeah, I mean, we're at a point in culture where it's like, we're so concerned with like intersectionality that we give ourselves all of these labels, like, I don't know, gender, race, descent, like experience. So we label ourselves this long string of labels. And then it comes to a point in discourse where the only thing you can talk about is yourself, really, because that's the only thing you know.
Yeah. What would you say to like those people who read poetry and are just like, what the heck is going on here? Like, what is this about? Right. Who like kind of clean, like, forgive my language here, but like clean, like, like precise, like terms, right. And things like that. Who are the types of people who say things like, just say what you mean, and like stop like beating around the bush, or like don't give me these metaphors, just like tell me what you're talking about, and don't like poetry. Would you like say would be just to someone like that?
Well, I mean, I would say like poetry is meant to be pleasurable. So like read around and find something that you like.
Okay.
Like don't give up on the first poem just because it's not to your taste.
Okay.
Like there's such a wide tapestry of, ways of writing poems.
Yeah.
That, you can, I mean, you probably find something you like, just like you could find like music you like. You wouldn't feel like, I don't like music.
Sure.
You know, like you would, yeah.
Sure. Okay.
So it might just be a matter of taste. And I think even someone who's like really educated in poetic technique or whatever still has taste. Things they like and don't. And can acknowledge that.
Yeah.
So that would be like the window in.
Okay.
And sometimes that is just not being aware of what to look for in the poem, like what to appreciate. So if you learn what some of the techniques are, suddenly it can be opened up to you. Like, I mean, I'm having that experience with like drawing. I don't know how to draw, but I've been with my kids, we've been doing some like little drawing lessons out of a book, and I'm like learning it alongside them. And I was like, oh, I didn't know this, you know? So now I'm looking at drawings in a different way. Yeah.
Okay.
So I wouldn't say that like any art form is something that you just get, or like maybe some people have a natural inclination, but something you learn to appreciate. But also find something you like.
Sure. Yeah. So like, I guess, and maybe you can like correct me if this is just like a not a helpful way of thinking about it. Like, I feel like I've thought about poetry as a way of communicating something about reality.
Yeah.
Right. And so I guess what I'm thinking about is like, if like, I like it when philosophers use precise terms, right? And they define their terms right from the get-go. And, you know, the nice philosophy books are the ones that are like really short because their arguments are really tight, and there's not all this like, you know, as like you tell your philosophy students, you're not writing an English paper, right? Don't use all this like flowery language and all this stuff. Get to your point. And all this stuff. And so I guess I'm thinking about it from that sense of like,
poems seem like excess language.
Right. Is not as getting at reality in a way that is like as helpful as precision and all this stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's so interesting, because I sometimes think of poems as like the neatest way to get at reality. Like it's so concise, and so it can do so many things simultaneously. Yeah. Where, I mean, it's like a poem is, I mean, there's so many analogies. Like there's the Ouroboros analogy, the snake eating its own tail. It's like circling back in on itself. It's a spiral. It's like the ball being batted back and forth across the net, or it's a prism. Like it's a prism turning and like revealing many angles simultaneously, or disclosing like multiple truths at the same time. Sure. Whereas I think of, I could be wrong. Like I think of philosophy as like operating according to like syllogism and proceeding like from point A to point B to point C, or what, like more linear. So it just seems like it works differently. Sure. Like poetry makes you see too. I mean, that's a big part of its project, is that it makes you see reality in such a way that like it's disclosing something, revealing something about what's beheld, and it's revealing something also about the beholder. You know, you writing the poem, or you the reader. Okay. So that key piece of sight is what I wouldn't always experience reading philosophy. And it's also very aware of the body, like you're hearing sounds that cause physical responses in you. So it's experiential in a way that like a syllogistic argument might not be. And we experience reality like through body. So it kind of reenacts that in a way that maybe what we might call more direct forms of language might not.
Sure. So it sounds like that would get back to like a question of the value of poetry piece of like, we're bodily creatures, right? We're physical and all of that. Okay. Yeah. But yeah, so I guess that also leads to this other impression people have of poetry, especially when we're like talking about poetry in the Bible, is like, if you talk about some section in the Bible, it's like, oh, it's poetry. Like somehow it carries, I think, this ring of like, oh, it's not true or something like that, right? Yeah. Like, oh, it's just a poem, right? Like you hear that phrase, is poetic, that it's somehow not true or something like that. Yeah. We could mean that. We could just mean it's imaginative. And that's maybe where that sight piece comes in. It's casting a vision. I think poetry's job is to tell the truth.
So when we say a certain portion of scripture is poetic, what I would mean by that is that it's operating, it's casting a vision, and it's operating according to a heightened attention to language, patterned language. And it's also doing many things simultaneously. And it's like a symbolic, like all art is symbolic. So it is, operating on the literal level and also on all of these other levels. So like we talked, like talking about Revelation.
Yeah.
That might be one example of something that someone might call poetic, or like the vision of the city of God in Revelation 21. And my feeling about that is that, like, it's incredibly poetic. Like, it gives you this glorious picture that moves your spirit when you hear it. There's like so much repetition in the language, and the cadences are so much a part of our human experience, just even through the tradition of hearing the scriptures down through the ages and hearing that reiterated and, echoing out in different pieces of literature. So we hear that resonating too when we hear it. Like, those are all things that make it, like, quote unquote poetic. But I don't know. In some way, I'm like, it's like kind of reductive not to say that it's also literal, because like when I read a poem, the first thing I do is ask, like, who's the speaker and what's happening.
Yeah.
Unless it's a poem that's operating only according to sound. There are some, but in most cases, there's like a situation and a speaker.
You said something that made me think of something else, which is poetry is something that is read out loud.
Oh, yeah.
Which wouldn't be the case. Like, you wouldn't have to read a syllogism out loud, right? Like, there's nothing about hearing the sound of a syllogism that really makes a difference.
Right. It's an utterance. Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah. Okay. That's also helpful.
Yeah. Even when you read a poem on a page, you have to hear it in your inner ear or it needs to be read aloud.
Right. And which, in Revelation, it talks about blessed are those who read this aloud and hear it and all that. Right. So, yeah. Thanks for talking with me, Kjerstin.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and please share with your friends.